During our last session, we examined how the Reagan administration began to implement, while also tacitly enlarging, the Carter Doctrine. We paid particular attention to the U.S. military interventions in Lebanon and Libya, neither of which yielded the outcomes intended. Here we encountered for the first time that absence of strategic realism that would remain one of the signatures of U.S. policy throughout America's war for the Greater Middle East. Today, we will turn to two other Reagan-era episodes in that larger war. These two episodes also qualify as interventions, albeit indirect ones. The first involves Iraq, and the second, Afghanistan, two countries that will draw even greater attention in decades to come. In some respects, what we will do today will be to locate the origins of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War that figured so centrally in the U.S. response to the 9/11 attacks. Events that occurred in the 1980s laid the basis for those wars. Let me revise that just slightly. Rather than two episodes, today's agenda will include 2.5 as a coda to our discussion of U.S. efforts on behalf of the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. You heard that right. We will also spend some time examining the truly bizarre event known to history as the Iran-Contra affair. But we begin by returning to January 20th, 1981, the date of Ronald Reagan's inauguration, also the date when Iran's government released the Americans it held captive for some 444 days. It was not Reagan's ascent to the presidency that prompted Iranian leaders to act. Prolonging the hostage crisis no longer served Iranian interests. Iran had far more pressing concerns to deal with. In September 1980, in a blatant act of aggression, Iraq had invaded Iran. Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein believed that the Islamic Revolution had weakened Iran militarily. Here was his chance to seize bits of territory that Iraq had long coveted. A short, victorious war would make clear who was the regional big kahuna. Not Shia-majority Iran, but Sunni-governed Iraq. Not Persian religious zealots, but secular-oriented Arab Baathists. Well, although Saddam Hussein was many things, no one ever took him for being a military genius. Not for the last time, he miscalculated and bit off far more than his army could handle. The ensuing Iran-Iraq War, as brutal as it was debilitating, ended up lasting 8 long years. For Iran, ending the hostage crisis was a way of clearing the decks, enabling it to focus on the immediate Iraqi threat. To prosecute the war, both nations needed to replace lost weapons. In the Soviet Union and France, Iraq had reliable suppliers. To replenish its own arsenal, Iran needed to repair its relations with the West. Releasing the hostages was one way of doing that. With the crisis out of the way, a State Department official commented just weeks into the war, Western nations would, quote, be able to talk to the Iranians about their military needs. Still, the initial U.S. response to the war's outbreak was to avoid taking sides. Condemnation of Iraqi aggression was notable by its absence. For example, the U.S. voted in favor of UN Security Council Resolution 479, passed unanimously just days after the Iraqi invasion. That resolution blithely sidestepped the question of who bore responsibility for starting the war in the first place. Indeed, the UN blandly called upon both Iraq and Iran to, quote, refrain immediately from any further use of force, and, quote, to accept any appropriate offer of mediation or conciliation. Pretty tepid stuff. So the United States stood by as these two countries duked it out, vaguely hoping for an outcome that would chasten but not dismember the Islamic Republic. Developments on the battlefield, however, frustrated those hopes. In fighting that recalled the trench warfare of World War I, Iran succeeded by 1982 in turning the tables. The invader was thrown back, with massive casualties on both sides. Iraq now found itself on the defensive. The possibility that Iran might emerge from the war triumphant now loomed. From Washington's point of view, the prospect of Iran becoming the dominant power in the Gulf was anathema. An Iranian victory, Secretary of State George Shultz wrote, would, quote, not only intimidate, but inundate U.S. allies in the region and would be, quote, a strategic disaster for the United States. To avert that disaster, the Reagan administration quietly abandoned its neutral posture and came to the rescue of Saddam Hussein. Iraq had severed its relations with the United States back in 1967 in the wake of the Six-Day War. Now Reagan dispatched a personal envoy to Baghdad to begin the process of mending fences. For that task, he chose Donald Rumsfeld, a once and future U.S. Secretary of Defense. So in December 1983, Rumsfeld called on Saddam in Baghdad. The hope, Rumsfeld later wrote, was that Washington might, quote, persuade the Iraqis to lean toward the United States. As events would soon prove, this was little more than wishful thinking. Nonetheless, the Reagan administration now commenced to make the United States a party to the Iran-Iraq War by throwing in with Saddam Hussein. Soon after Rumsfeld's visit, Washington and Baghdad agreed to restore diplomatic relations. The State Department had already given Saddam an unearned gift, removing Iraq from its list of state sponsors of terrorism. More substantively, the United States started providing Saddam with sensitive intelligence about Iranian troop movements. The Reagan administration facilitated Saddam's efforts to restock Iraq's arsenal with weapons purchased from France and other Western nations. Simultaneously, Reagan inaugurated a program called Operation Staunch, which aimed to prevent Iran from acquiring new weapons or spare parts for its existing arsenal, largely acquired from the United States. So Washington okayed Saddam's purchase of made-in-the-USA computers, transport planes, helicopters, and navigation aids. It also offered guarantees to enable cash-strapped Iraq to buy on credit. And it gave advice on how to employ Iraqi forces. It even authorized the transfer of microorganisms useful in developing chemical and biological weapons. Of course, Saddam already possessed an arsenal of chemical weapons, which he inflicted on Iran and on his own people. Now, U.S. officials did make a point of condemning Saddam's use of chemical weapons. Actions did not go beyond words, however. U.S. material support for Iraq continued unimpeded. All of this amounted to intervention by indirection, the Carter Doctrine enforced through an unsavory proxy. No U.S. troops were fighting and dying. No U.S. military aircraft were dropping bombs or launching missiles, at least not yet. Still, here was an early indication of the challenges inherent in implementing the Carter Doctrine. To preempt one power thought to be seeking preeminence in the Persian Gulf, the United States was aiding another power that was already seeking to do just that. To contain Iran, the United States was underwriting Saddam's criminal conduct and encouraging his ambitions. In retrospect, the episode bears reflection for at least two reasons. First, it serves as a useful reminder that in America's war for the greater Middle East, ideals matter only when they happen to be convenient. Legal and moral considerations did not have any measurable influence on U.S. policy toward the Iran-Iraq war. Values counted for essentially zilch. Second, the episode reminds us that Iran, even today viewed as a continuing threat to Persian Gulf stability, just may have its own share of grievances against Washington and its own reasons to see the United States as posing a security threat. Iran held several dozen American hostages for 444 days. This was nothing short of an outrage, of course. Yet in the end, all of those held captive were released, and they returned to their families unharmed. For its part, the United States collaborated with Saddam Hussein in an unjust war that claimed many tens of thousands of Iranian lives, both military and civilian. Moreover, Iranians have long remembered the 1953 coup in Iran, backed by the United States. Which country has the greater cause to hold a grudge? Which has the larger complaint?